Okay, hello everybody. It's Saturday. You know, I figure I'll do an unprepared talk on a few verses. And because I'm at the park and it's early, but you get to see a few of my friends. I just got Albert because one of the guys that picks him up by the name of Slim is looking for him to go to work right now. And so I just told Albert that one of his bosses is here. You might get to see Angel. Angel's an old friend of mine for many years. And he's sitting over at the other benches here at the park, Saturday at 9. I've been reading Matthew, I forget the chapter. I think it's Matthew 12, and then there's a reference to Isaiah 42. But I'll tell the story. This just came to my mind the other day as I was reading. And then I usually try to, if there's some significant thing I can say, like happens on a certain date. So today's date is, whatever it is. Today's date is May 11, 2019. Look, I write 2018 still on something. So there was a show at NAS Kingsville, not a show, but two pilots ejected from a plane, one of the trainer planes, NAS Kingsville, about 42 miles that way, and NAS Corpus Christi is about 2 miles down that way, okay? So when I first came to Texas, I was stationed at NAS Kingsville. That's how I wound up. I joined the Navy and went to Kingsville. But because there was this ejection of the plane, the pilots are safe, but, that made it to the news for today's date. And so I real quickly referenced or Googled the death of a pilot at a air show in 2000. Now, you don't have a lot of deaths at air shows in Texas because I researched it a few years back because of what I'm going to tell you in a second, and then we'll teach. But in the year 2000, there was a fighter pilot who had a lot of combat flights. He was in his 30s, I believe, and his name was Bryson Phillips. And that day at the air show in Kingsville, where I used to be stationed, hi, that's Kitty over there. He's coming, Albert's coming. At that day, the plane was coming inverted, went straight up, and then started coming straight down. And as that plane in the year 2000 was coming straight down at that air show, people had said, oh, it's not going to make it. And he was a very skilled pilot. But sure enough, that plane crashed. Most of you know, I worked at the Kingsville Fire Department. Of course, after getting out of the Navy, eventually in 1983, he's coming. I got on the Kingsville Fire Department. And I was an engineer, fight fires, drive trucks. But that day, I worked ambulance overtime, the day of the plane crash, which is something ambulance overtime is good, meaning you get paid good. And a lot of the younger paramedics would take that type of duty because, they're making overtime. Here comes Albert. But because I was like senior and I had you say hi, Albert, I'm going to teach.
Hi.
I'm teaching. I'm doing a little talk to you.
You said that you gave me $1.
Oh, I didn't. You get it.
Oh, yeah.
I was sitting up here for maybe an hour. I should have gave it to Angel. No, you get it.
Good.
Look at Albert goes to work. Say Albert works.
Albert
He's going right now, and that's.
I When I get my Social Security.
He's supposed to. I could talk about that because he's already of age, but they tie people up when they're that age. Yeah, he's past 62, but okay. But that day at the air show in 2000, surprisingly, because even my friends at the firehouse, the other younger paramedics, they all wanted to work overtime. have a list. Who's going to want to work at the air show at Naval Air Station? I said, I'll take it to that. John, like, because I never would normally work that. I just took it because I thought it would be nice to go to the air show. And lo and behold, tragically, Lieutenant Bryson Phillips died that day. In one of the rare occasions in our country, there's not a lot of deaths at air shows. And certainly that was the only one in Kingsville, and it might have been the only one in Texas. So they're rare for pilots to die when the Blue Angels and others are flying. But Bryson Phillips died that day. And of course it was, as the plane crashed, the ambulance normally is just there for standby, like we're standing by in case people faint or somebody has a heart attack. We're really not there expecting something like that to happen. And I was with a friend, the paramedic who worked with me. His name was Sam Smithwick, and I guess he still works at the firehouse. Sam was a good friend of mine, and I always tried to stay calm on the radio, because when you call on the emergency radios, I used to get upset because some of the other firemen, they would panic, like they called a big house fire, and they're panicking, what is it, or a plane crash. And I used to tell the guys, look, we're the emergency crew. So I would always, be real calm. We had big fires over the years. And as I would show up to the fires, if it was a working fire, meaning, this is a big engulfed house or apartments, I would just get on the radio for the fire truck. Whatever unit, 118 Central, this would be a working fire. And I would say it like that, just to get back on the panic that was set up. And I remember later that night, my captain, he asked me, he said, when you got there, was it really going up? Of course they knew later, but he wanted to know how far along the fire was when I radioed that in calmly. I said, yes, it was fully blessed. He said, it didn't sound like it. I said, we're not supposed to. So I do remember this when that plane crashed. Now that was quite a big event, tragic. And I told Sam, give me the radio. Ambulance 165 to Central. Go ahead. They said, we have a plane down. Just like that. And later, the guys at the firehouse told me, one of the rookies that day was at dispatch, because it was on a weekend. They put him on dispatch duty, One of the rookies said, John just called on the radio at firehouse from the ambulance. And John said, we have a plane down. What does that mean? And then the guys jumped up. It's a plane crash, tragically. So I told Sam that day, I said, go ahead and take the ambulance right. We're not there to get on the runway, but I said, go ahead. We went up to the fence area that had to be cut. I happened to be the first firefighter on scene where Bryson Phillips died. And at that crash site, you saw hardly anything left. I mean, he was coming straight down into the ground. But there was just a little debris. The only body part. You could see a foot, just the foot, nothing else in the boot. I guess somehow, that's tragic to see. So, his name was Bryson Phillips. He died that day at the air show in Kingsville. Now, that's what caused me to say I'll add something that happened. The two chapters, I think it's Matthew 12. But in Matthew 12, if I get the chapter right, the stories will be right. I actually covered one part of that chapter a lot over the years because I liked it. In this chapter is where Jesus, it says, is walking with the disciples. And they go through the corn. Now, some commentators say the grain and the barley fields. And, I've even said it over the years because the historical studying and all, you translate things and you look at historical background. But, I used to think because of that reason they would say, therefore corn did not grow in Palestine. They didn't grow it in the first century in Palestine, particularly where Jesus was. And so therefore some translators translate this as grain and barley, wheat. But as I read it, the other night, I said, God made all these seeds. It's certainly possible it was corn. But the more educated, we'll do the King James today and believe it. So the disciples got corn. But it's the Sabbath day. And as they were eating from this free food, which was permitted, by the way, it wasn't like they were stealing, God had given ordinances in the Old Testament that when you have your fields, now this was not so much a form of warfare, but people that were producing had to acknowledge that God was the giver of that. And they were told, when you harvest your fields, you leave these corners unharvested for the poor of the land. So that's a biblical, rebuke against a strong capitalistic mindset, if you will. Because a strong capitalistic mindset says what? I harvested this land, and this is the best, if you will, system you can have, and therefore I'll give nothing away. But God gave it as a command. He said, nope, you farmers, when I bless you, you leave a portion of of that field and you don't harvest it all. And it's going to go to the poor. So what the disciples and Jesus were doing, I wasn't going to talk too much on it, but I will, was legitimate, except in the mind of the religious leaders who developed ideas, and this is referred to as the tradition of the elders. And what they did was they made a legalistic practice out of the God-given law. So what they did this day, they said, why are your disciples violating the Sabbath, violating God's law by picking this corn, to the more liberal ones, this barley and grain? They're violating God's law. Now, they were not violating the law of God, but in this case, they were indeed violating what's called the tradition of the elders, which is the later development of the extension of the law. And it became just legalism. And so then Jesus responds to them and says, did you not read in your Old Testament Bible what David did? When he entered into the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful. Hi, Cody.
What's up, John?
I'm doing a Bible teaching. I gave my $1 away. If you want to smoke, you got to ask on camera.
Oh, can I have a cigarette?
Albert got the $1 and I forgot. I still had it on me. And take one, give one to Kitty.
Ask for prayer. Like on camera.
You ask
Yes.
for
Kit, I pray, Father, I pray for healing. I pray that you bless them.
I
I pray
need prayer
that
to
you
find a
work.
place to stay.
And to open up doors
And a
for
healthy
them.
husband that loves me.
Be good, be good. I'm on video. I'm teaching. No, I'm going to walk because it's getting windy and rainy. So the disciples were being accused. I'm glad you get to see. That's two friends of mine, Cody and Kitty. And the disciples were being accused of something that was not unlawful, but in the mind of the religious legalism, it was unlawful. And Jesus says, remember what David did. Now, this is the story Jesus brings up from the Old Testament. I taught Samuel, and you find the story in Samuel. King David was on the run from Saul one day. Saul's after his life. And David had his ragtag team of men who began following him. This was the early development of the kingdom that David will take authority over down the road, much like Jesus and the disciples. People that were despised, dejected, rejected. And so King David had this kind of following in the earlier days. And so when he's on the run from Saul, Scripture said he went into the house, the new house of Abiathar, or the house of God, in the days of this particular priest. And the priest had told King David, what are you here for? He says, and David lies. But he said, I'm on a special mission for Saul. and I have these men with me, and we have nothing to eat. Now, he was lying at that moment. But he was on the run from King Saul. So the priest had told David, well, I really don't have any food except for the consecrated bread or the showbread that the priests themselves were ordained to set on the table in their work for God. So it was sort of like the priest said, I don't have any food, but I do have this holy bread. Now look, it was unlawful for David and his men to eat that, according to the law. But the priest that day did indeed give it to David, and David and his men ate. And it's interesting, if you go further into the story, David's also looking for a weapon that day, because he's on the run, he needs some weapon. And that day the priest said, the only thing that I have here, David, if I get the story right, is the sword that you used to take the head of Goliath off. And I believe David takes it that day. But the point Jesus makes is, to the religious leaders who are now accusing him and his men, Jesus says, David did something that indeed was a violation of a particular law, but he got away with it. And Jesus is the root and the offspring of David, the bright morning star. And there's more to this story than just meets the eye, because David also got away with other things in the Old Testament that were violations of the law. When he set up the tabernacle of David in Jerusalem and the restoration of the Ark of the Covenant, David set it up in an open tent at Jerusalem. And he had this worship and praise called the Tabernacle of David. And that was indeed a violation of the way the structure of the Ark would be set up. And even in the story of David, there's a time where they would violate certain rules in the retrieving of the Ark, and a man will grab it and touch it, and then God takes his life. And so there were strict rules in governing the tabernacle system, but yet when David set up that Ark of the Covenant openly in the tabernacle of David, he's worshiping. And there's open access, everybody could see that Ark, and it was blessed because this was a type of the new covenant where there'd be an open access to God. So David, Jesus himself is identified as the offspring of David. So in this example that he's rebuking religious leaders with, he says, look what David did. And how much more can Jesus and his men, because he will tell them, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath, and a greater than the temple is standing among you right now. Jesus himself and his men, the early community, the true people of God, which we would be called the temple of God ourselves, the believers. And he gave them that example to prove to them that their religious bias and mindsets, and he actually says, if you knew what this meant, I have mercy in that sacrifice, he says, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So he powerfully corrects them in their, this is a famous story that I always like teaching to show that. He also says, what about the priests in the temple, the priestly sacrifices? The priests, he says, profane, according to your mindset, religious leaders, they profane the Sabbath because they do activity, meaning the priests themselves do ceremonial sacrificial activities on the Sabbath day. How are they getting away with it, religious leaders? Well, that's service to God, you see. But how much more? If you knew what that meant, I will have mercy, not sacrifice. How much more to do good on the Sabbath days? To heal a man with a withered hand, which we'll get to in a second. So what they did was they allowed room for themselves to do what they felt was the work of God and the will of God as priests on the Sabbath, doing the activity, but yet to set a man free, to heal a man, or for his disciples to simply eat corn, if you will, on the Sabbath, they found that highly offensive. And it was just a religious mindset now, not seeing the true intent of God and his purpose. And he rebukes them. Now, the part that I actually wanted to get to comes after this. Now, Jesus begins healing and doing wonderful works. And there's a man, it says, with a withered hand, it was the Sabbath day, and there happened to be a man there who had a crippled hand, a paralyzed hand. And it's the religious leaders who bring it up. Like, what are you going to do? Now he says to the man, stretch forth your hand. Those Sabbath day he healed him. And Jesus brings up again the story. He says, and what about if you had a sheep and one of them was lost? Would you go after it even if it's the Sabbath? And in other portions of the gospel, Jesus said, what about if you had one of your animals fall into a ditch on the Sabbath? Would you? So once again, they allowed room to have mercy upon animals and sheep and other things that are trapped or caught on the Sabbath day. Oh yes, we'll free it. But when he frees people from physical limitations through doing works of healing, they condemn him. So he's just challenging. They don't understand, their mindsets are so limited. Now after he heals the man with the withered hand, I think this is all Matthew 12, then something interesting happens. A lot of people begin bringing people to him. He's healing a lot of people. And then Jesus says to them, don't tell anybody about this. Okay, now it says, he told them that so the scripture would be fulfilled. And then it quotes Isaiah 42. Now when you read the Bible, it's important that you pay attention. And this was the main point I really wanted to talk about as I was reading it the other day. It says Jesus told these people that were gathering around. It was sort of like a crowd mentality and a popularity mindset. And he began telling them, don't tell anybody about this. And then the writer of the Gospel of Matthew says, this he did so it would be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. If you go to Isaiah 42, it talks about the ministry of Jesus. But it says that he will not cause his voice to be heard in the street. That the Spirit of the Lord will be upon Jesus. Many great prophecies in Isaiah about the ministry of Jesus. But this is just talking specifically about his voice. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench until he send forth judgment unto victory. Unto him will the Gentiles trust. The isles shall wait for his law. And he will not cause his voice to be heard in the street. In the Matthew quote in King James, it says the same thing, but in the Isaiah chapter 42 in King James, it really makes it more pointed. That the reason Jesus told the people that he was healing, not to say anything, was so he would fulfill the prophecy of humility, not seeking the glory of men. That the prophecy would be fulfilled, that he will not cause his voice to be heard in the street. Jesus said those that seek honor from men cannot seek the honor that comes from God only. But those that seek to simply please and glorify God, those are not men pleasers. That was the interesting fulfillment of prophecy. And I know many times when we read those prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling, it's easy to just identify him with the other more prominent or famous ones. But the reason Jesus told the people that he was healing, do not tell anybody, is so he would fulfill the humility portion and aspect of his ministry, not seeking the glory that comes from men. Now, Jesus could handle that, meaning he didn't care what people thought, and he wasn't seeking to get a big audience. But he also left us examples. So it's mindful that he was also showing us how we're going to function in God's kingdom. And it's very easy to get caught up into the trap of how many people. I was just checking my videos before I turned this on. I uploaded videos this morning. I was checking on BitChute and I said, okay, it's got so many views, but I was looking at the functionality. But it's easy to get caught up in it. I know sometimes well-meaning men talk about how many people can attend, a big attendance, and in ministry circles, look, a lot of times that does indeed drive people in a wrong way. Many years ago, meaning you find your identity in how many views, how many hundreds of or thousands, how many people come to church, how many people show up. A lot of times that's what drives ministry. And Jesus is giving an example, and he's basically showing us even if God's doing a mighty work, don't be seeking that. He's fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. Bruised reed he will not break, smoking flax he will not quench, neither will he cause his voice to be heard in the street. That's why he was telling those people, and don't go tell anybody else. Now, oftentimes they would violate what Jesus said, and they would still go brag. Okay, the woman at the well and other people would go and tell other people. But he was setting that example for us. And Peter says that in his letters in the New Testament, that Jesus gave us an example. Not only do we often forget the example portion, okay, meaning he's showing us the works of God. Now that was really the 2 points I wanted to make, that as followers, we have to avoid getting caught up in that type of a trap. We want to do the will of God, and we want to do it and be disciplined to do it. Some days I feel, yesterday I was upset, not a big thing, but I was stopping to get gas. And I've mentioned this before. I cannot remember which side of my car to put the gas thing in. I still forget that. And so as I was pulling into one of the gas stations, it came to my mind, I got to remember which side. And I just said, no, I know, it's got to be the driver's side. I've been doing this now for how many years? And I stopped where the driver's side would be the pump. Oh, here's my friend Mike. And it was the wrong side. And I did no big thing. I thought, how can I not remember that? And some things will upset me, What you learn to do over time is everything you do it, you try to do for the glory of God, and you fulfill it because it's the purpose of God for you. There'll indeed come a time in the experience of Jesus, the first appearing in Jerusalem before the crucifixion week, or before which we recently celebrated, the Passover and the resurrection. But a week earlier we read that the people were praising him as he showed up. Hosanna in the highest. All these wonderful accolades. And then within a week's period of time, he's executed for the sins of the world. But we learn that it's easy to be driven by that mentality that says, I'd like to cause my voice to be heard in the street. Now, we certainly want the message to be heard, don't get me wrong. But we want to avoid that self-promotion mentality. Now, really, I think those are the two main things. If I knew I was going to speak today, because it's Saturday, I would have brought the notes, because there were a few notes I wanted to write, I wanted to mention. But I just decided to do it because, like I mentioned earlier. So today, these types of videos that I just made, you'll see them like you will later today. And I try to be cognizant that they're going to be replayed, because that's the purpose. So I understand that if I say right now, tomorrow, Sunday, I'm not going to make a video. If you see this in repeats, those little notes that you just heard, obviously are not going to always apply. But we do the best we can. It gets difficult at times to try to organize everything. And so we do the best we can. All right? I want to pray for you guys. You got to see Cody. You got to see Albert. My friend Mike D, he just came by real quick. He might not want to be on video. He's a good friend, all right? Some of my friends don't always want to be on video. All right, let me pray for you guys. Father, I pray a blessing on everybody. I pray that the word of the Lord will go forth in a little while when the friends show up here, that everything will work out good today. It's a little rainy day. And I pray that we will learn just from the examples that I talked about today, that we will be able to emulate, be more like Jesus. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.